The violin case lay open and empty on the piano stool, and Miss Prudence Wraxall was laughing in a way that made my collar feel suddenly tight. "Gone to Winchester, if you can credit it," she said, waving her fan toward the door, as though she might waft the missing musician back through it. "Left us a room full of the bishop's finest guests, and not so much as a scale to show for it. I had been in Bishopsley a fortnight only, curate on loan from my own parish to assist with the confirmation classes, and I confess I had come to the reception that October evening, chiefly for the plum cake. I did not expect to witness anything I would carry with me the rest of my ministry, but witness it I did, from a chair near the fire, not 6 yards from the piano, and I set it down now, exactly as I saw it, so that no one who reads this account may say it was exaggerated in the telling. The bishop's reception room was a fine one. High plaster ceiling touched with gilt, tall windows hung in wine-dark velvet, and along the walls a company of some 40 guests, canons and their wives, 2 visiting archdeacons, a baronet down from London, and at the center of it all, uncertain what was to become of their evening's promised entertainment, the dignitaries who had been told there would be music. The music, as it happened, had absconded with a young lady from the confectioner's, or so the footman whispered to me, and Miss Wraxall, the bishop's sister, and, in the absence of a Mrs. Wraxall or a Mrs. Bishop, the presiding hostess of the palace, was left holding an empty program and 40 expectant faces. It was then that Hattie Colborne came through with the coal scuttle. She was 21, I should think, though she carried herself with the quick, unregarded efficiency of someone twice that age who has long since stopped waiting to be noticed. She was the palace's hall maid, laid fires, carried linens, answered bells, and she came into that gilded room, now only to bank the fire before the guests grew chilled, her apron still dusted with coal black, her cap slightly crooked from an evening of stair-climbing. I had seen her a dozen times that fortnight, and never once wondered what occupied her thoughts. Miss Wraxall's eye fell on her the way an eye falls on the nearest curious thing in a room grown suddenly awkward. "Colborne," she said, and there was no unkindness in it yet, only that carelessness of the comfortable toward the unregarded. "You're often about that piano with your dusting cloth of a morning. Get up and entertain the bishop's guests, won't you, since Mr. Vane has abandoned us so thoroughly?" A ripple of laughter went round the room. Not cruel laughter, I want to be fair to them, but the easy laughter of people who have never once imagined that the girl who blacks their grates might have anything within her worth hearing. The baronet chuckled into his wine. One of the archdeacons murmured something to his neighbor behind a gloved hand. A young canon's wife tittered outright and then, catching herself, pressed her fan to her lips. Miss Wraxall herself was smiling, pleased with her own wit, already turning to say something else to the lady beside her, the dare tossed off and half forgotten before it had finished leaving her mouth. Hattie straightened with the coal scuttle still in her hand. I watched her face, because I always watch faces. It is a curate's habit, born of hearing confessions and reading congregations for the truth beneath the words they choose. I expected to see shame there, the hot color of a girl caught out and mocked before her betters. I did not see that. I saw something quieter and stranger, a kind of arithmetic going on behind her eyes, as though she were weighing the room, weighing the dare, weighing something in herself that none of us could see. "If it please you, ma'am," she said, and set the scuttle down by the hearth with a care that seemed, to me, oddly deliberate, as though she were closing a door on one version of the evening before stepping through into another. "I'll want a moment to wash the coal from my hands." The room laughed again, delighted now, certain this was some rustic joke that would end in an awkward chord or two, and a great deal of merriment at the maid's expense. Miss Wraxall waved her permission with the same fan, still smiling her careless smile. "By all means, Colborne. We are in no hurry. Astonish us." She meant it, I am certain, as nothing more than a kindness dressed as a jest, the sort of thing said to smooth over an awkward silence before supper. She had no notion, none of us had any notion, what she had just set in motion. Hattie was gone 4 minutes by my pocket watch. I know it was 4 minutes because I found myself, oddly, counting them, the way one counts the minutes before a verdict. When she returned, her hands were clean and pink from the scrubbing, her cap set straight, and she crossed the long room to the piano with a stillness that seemed, of a sudden, entirely out of place among the coal scuttles and the linen closets where I had, until that moment, imagined her whole existence to be spent. She sat. The room had not yet stopped smiling. I saw the baronet lean toward his wife to whisper something further. I saw Miss Wraxall settle back into her chair with the satisfied air of a woman anticipating a diverting few minutes before supper was announced. No one, I think, expected silence. Silence is not what one expects from a joke. But silence is what fell, all the same, the moment Hattie Colborne laid her hands upon the keys and did not yet play. She sat with her fingers resting on the ivory, not moving, for perhaps 3 or 4 seconds, an eternity, in a room full of people primed to laugh. I have thought of that pause 100 times since. It was not hesitation. It was the pause of a person gathering something vast enough that it could not be rushed into being. I have felt that same pause, once or twice, in my own pulpit, before the one sentence of a sermon that matters more than all the rest, the sentence one has been building toward without quite admitting it to oneself. Then she began, and the room began, very slowly, to change. The first notes were so soft that I saw 2 guests near the door lean forward, uncertain they had heard anything at all. A rocking, murmuring figure low in the left hand, like water moving under a thin skin of ice, and above it, entering almost shyly, a melody I knew, though I had not expected to hear it that evening, or in that room. Faurés après un rêve, the song of a dream remembered upon waking, of a happiness glimpsed, and then, gently, mourned. I had heard the piece played by trained hands in London concert rooms, by musicians in good coats, with good instruments, and years of instruction behind them. I had never heard it played as Hattie Colborne played it that night, from memory, without a single page of music before her, as though the notes were not being recalled but discovered, freshly, for the first time, in that very room, by a girl who had learned them by firelight after her chores were done. The laughter died first. It did not stop all at once. A chuckle here, cut short. A smile there, fading by degrees, as though the guests themselves were embarrassed to have been caught mid-mirth by something that plainly deserved none of it. Miss Wraxall's fan, which had been moving in idle little arcs, stopped altogether and lay still against her silk skirts. I watched her face very closely in that moment, curate's habit again, and I saw the exact instant her expression changed from amused indulgence to something closer to disbelief, her lips parting slightly, as though she meant to speak, and had forgotten what there was to say. The melody rose. Hattie's back, which had been slightly bowed over the keys, as though from long habit of stooping to hearths and cupboards, straightened by degrees, until she sat as upright and as unconscious of herself as any concert artist I had ever watched from a subscription seat. Her right hand carried the tune with a phrasing so unhurried, so exactly weighted, that I found myself holding my own breath at the top of each rising phrase, waiting for her to let it fall, and each time she let it fall exactly where the heart wanted it to fall, and not one half-beat sooner. I am no musician myself, only a lover of it from the pew in the parlor, but even I could hear what was happening. The candles along the mantel seemed to burn steadier. The tall windows, black now with the October evening, seemed to draw the sound of the piano out into themselves and give it back richer, deeper, as though the whole house had grown suddenly attentive. Somewhere behind me, a lady's fan, which had been fluttering, went as still as Miss Wraxall's, and I heard, very faintly, the small catch of someone's breath. The piece built toward its center, the melody climbing into a phrase of such open longing that I saw the elder of the 2 archdeacons, a man I had taken, from his stern gray whiskers and his clipped manner at supper, to be entirely unmovable, draw a plain handkerchief from his breast pocket and hold it, unused, in his folded hands, as though merely having it near were comfort enough. The baronet had set down his wine entirely and sat with his elbows on his knees, leaning toward the piano like a man straining to hear a voice calling to him from very far away, out of some room in his own past. And Hattie Colborne played on, her eyes half closed, her whole being given over entirely to the dream the music spoke of, a dream half remembered, half already lost, and mourned all the more tenderly for the losing of it. I have never, before or since, watched a performer so completely forget that she was being watched. I do not know how to render for you, reading this account, what it is to sit in a room of 40 strangers and feel every one of them stop being strangers to one another, drawn instead into the same held breath, the same private ache, by the hands of a girl who not 1 hour before had been thought fit for nothing grander than the coal scuttle. But that is what I witnessed, and I set it down as plainly as I am able, because I do not think plain telling can improve upon it. The melody turned toward its close now, the dream in the music beginning at last to fade, to slip from the dreamer's grasp exactly as dreams do upon waking, and Hattie let the notes thin, and soften, and stretch, drawing out the last falling phrase until it seemed almost too fragile to bear its own weight. A single thread of sound suspended over the whole silent room. The room had gone so still that I could hear, quite clearly, the small tick of the mantel clock beneath the music, and beneath even that, I fancied, 40 held breaths. She brought the piece down to its final chord, low, warm, unresolved and resolved all at once, the sound of a sorrow that has made its peace with itself, and let it ring. She did not lift her hands at once. She let the chord die away entirely into the plaster and gilt of that high ceiling, into the velvet at the windows, into the silence of 40 people who had come expecting an evening's diversion, and had been given, instead, something none of them had words ready for. The silence that followed was not the silence of disappointment. I have sat through enough dull recitations, in enough drawing rooms, to know that silence, and this was not it. This was the silence of a room that does not wish to be the first to break a spell. It held for 3 full seconds. I counted them, out of the same habit that had me counting Hattie's absence at the washstand, before it broke, all at once, into applause so sudden and so entire that I saw the footman by the door start visibly at the noise of it, and one of the archdeacons rose halfway from his chair before catching himself. Miss Prudence Wraxall rose from her chair before any of her guests. I have thought a great deal, in the years since, about what it must have cost a woman of her position to do what she did next, in front of a bishop's assembled company, and I have come to admire her for it more, not less, the longer I have turned it over. She did not sit and clap politely, and let the moment pass into pleasant memory, which would have been the easier course by far. She crossed the room, her silk skirts loud in that hush, and she stood before Hattie Colborne, who had risen from the piano stool looking, for the first time that evening, uncertain of herself again, as though the dream she had just conjured for the rest of us had left her too, blinking and half returned to the ordinary world of coal scuttles and bells. "I asked you to entertain us," Miss Wraxall said, and her voice, pitched to Carrie, shook very slightly, meaning it as a jest at your expense, and I am ashamed of it. You have given this room something I do not believe any hired musician from Winchester could have given it, however fine his coat. I beg your pardon, Colborne, Miss Colborne, most sincerely, and before every person here. It was, I think, the miss that undid the room entirely, small a word as it was. I saw more than one guest reach for a handkerchief, who had not needed one during the music itself, and the canon's wife, who had tittered earlier, now would not meet anyone's eye at all. Hattie curtsied, a small, practiced, servant's curtsy, out of long habit, and then seemed to catch herself, and stood instead simply and quietly upright, meeting Miss Wraxall's eye with a steadiness I would not have thought possible in a girl who, 4 minutes earlier, had been holding a coal scuttle. "I learned it from my mother, ma'am," she said. "She played for the chapel choir before her health failed her. There was never money for lessons beyond what she could teach me herself of an evening, after the fires were all laid and the house gone quiet." "Then there will be money now," said Miss Wraxall, and I heard in her voice the particular firmness of a person resolving, on the instant and before witnesses, to set right what carelessness had nearly let slip past her entirely. She turned to the bishop, who had come forward from his place near the fire with an expression I can only call quietly astonished, and the two of them spoke together in low tones for a moment, before Miss Wraxall turned back to the room at large, and to Hattie. "There is a master in Exeter," she said, "who trained under the Paris Conservatoire, and has, I am told, more patience for a gifted ear than for a well-connected name. I intend to write to him this very week, And I intend that this palace shall bear whatever cost he asks. You will not black another grate in this house, Miss Colborne, unless you wish it. And I rather think, after tonight, that you shall have far better uses for your hands than that." A murmur went round the room, warm now, entirely unlike the laughter that had opened the evening, and I saw the baronet incline his head toward Hattie in something very like a bow. I will not pretend that Hattie Colborne's life was transformed in a single evening, the way a tale for children is transformed by a single stroke of good fortune. I stayed on in Bishopsley through the following spring, and I know something of what came after. The master in Exeter did indeed take her on, and wrote back within the month that he had rarely examined an ear so true in a pupil so entirely untaught. The bishop himself arranged that she should lodge, respectably, with a canon's widow near the cathedral close, while she studied 3 days of every week. And Miss Wraxall, to her very great credit, did not let the matter rest with a single grand gesture made before an admiring room, but wrote to Hattie regularly, and came to hear her play whenever her lessons permitted a small gathering, and became, in time, less her patroness than her friend, the two of them often seen walking the cathedral green together of a Sunday afternoon, deep in conversation. I heard, the following autumn, that Hattie Colborne had played for a gathering of the diocese's clergy at the cathedral itself, no longer in an apron, but in a modest gown of her own choosing, and that the dean had asked her, with great courtesy, whether she might consider a small recital of her own the following spring. I was not present for that occasion, having been called back to my own parish by then, but I did not need to have been present to believe it entirely. But all of that lay ahead of us, unknown, on the evening I am telling you of now. What I knew then, sitting in my chair by the fire with my plum cake forgotten and going stale on its plate, was only this: that a room full of comfortable, well-fed, well-satisfied people had been dared, by their own carelessness, into hearing something true, and that the truest thing in that gilded room had come, in the end, not from the visiting musician who never arrived, but from the hall maid who had only ever been asked, until that night, to keep the fires burning, and never once to warm anything else. I have preached a good many sermons since that October evening on the subject of talents buried and talents found, and I confess that in every one of them, whether I name her from the pulpit or not, I am thinking of Hattie Colborne, rising from a coal scuttle to a piano stool, and of the 4 minutes she took to wash her hands before she would consent to be seen, and of the silence that followed the last chord of a dream half remembered. A silence I have never once, in all my years in orders, heard equaled in any cathedral, however grand. It is, I think, the truest sermon I ever heard preached without a single word, and I carry it with me still, into every room where someone unregarded is waiting only to be asked.